Hello everyone, welcome to this. This is the fifth Lit Talk of the year from the QUB Litorific. My name's Thomas Copeland. I'll be guiding us through this event. It's a real pleasure tonight to welcome SDLP leader Colum Eastwood this evening. When we planned these events, Colum, we would have welcomed you for a wonderful meal, plenty of pints afterwards. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that on this occasion, but you may join the pub crawl that we have arranged with Mary Lou McDonald, Julian Smith, Ian Blackford, and I'm sure we'll all have plenty to chat about. But for now,
I've had a few pints with a few of those people, so I'm happy to do it again anytime you're up.
Well, for now, we'll have to thank you for sitting in front of your laptop once more for us, and we very much appreciate it because I'm sure you'd rather be doing much more interesting things than a Friday evening. As ever, I'd like to thank the Litorific for organising this event, keeping the head held high during the pandemic and trying to keep these kind of events going. It's so important. Matt Lee, Ryan Hoey and the entire committee have put a lot of work into these events, so I want to thank them very much. Colin, we've got loads of questions that have been submitted. I've managed to kind of put them into a rough roadmap, and then we've got lots of random questions there at the end. You can submit your questions if you're watching this on whatever server you're watching on, just by popping them into the Facebook live stream or whatever stream you're watching on, and they'll be relayed back to me. And we've got lots of really interesting questions that many of you submitted prior to the event as well. So Colin, if you're happy enough, I'd like to dive right in. Why don't we start at the very beginning? You joined the SDLP, as I understand, in 1998 at the age of only 14. Even for a politician, that's a very early start. There must have been, is that a political family, Colum, or certainly a family that's not adverse to politics?
Well, I suppose, I mean, we're from Derry and they're not a party political family, but my father was a union rep and all of that, and my grandfather was active in the civil rights movement and was, I think, hit over the head on the 5th of October, like many other people on Joke Street, and we just had a sense, I suppose, growing up of of a belief in justice and civil rights and peace. And John Hume was always a huge influence in our house and in our town and my school, so Collins College, and he was kind of everywhere. And I even at that young age, and I know it sounds strange at 14 to be joining a political party, but I was just a very ordinary and normal teenager, but politics was something I was interested in. Friend of our family's, Giovanni Doran, was involved in the SDLP and asked me if I was always kind of having a go at him and telling him all the things I thought the party were doing wrong, and he asked me would I come out and campaign during the referendum campaign for the Good Friday Agreement. So I did, and I was kind of bitten by the bug. I just fundamentally believed in Hume's and others' analysis that I was a very strong nationalist, but I believed that killing somebody for it wasn't a good idea, that you had to build peace, and the Good Friday Agreement seemed to me like a moment for young people to get involved.
You said you kind of campaigned during the Good Friday Agreement referendum. What do you mean by that? I mean, were you at the front doors? Were you holding lots of leaflets while other people were at the front doors? What can a 14-year-old do in an all-island referendum?
I suppose it depends what kind of 14-year-old you are. I was a fairly cheeky one, I think, and we were knocking doors, and the SDLP mounted a pretty big effort during the referendum campaign. A lot of other people didn't bother, but we did. I remember I started off kind of walking beside people and listening, and then I asked could I knock a door myself, and they said go ahead. And we were in the Brandywell in Derry, near the Bogside, fairly Republican area, and they knocked the door, and guy said to me, be careful of the language, but basically get off my effing porch. And I said, well, what's wrong with you? He said, you can take that having Good Friday Agreement with you as well, or there'll be consequences. So that was the first door.
Some things never change. Yeah.
No, well, exactly. I think the next night somebody nearly threw up on me on their way out, pushed me when I knocked the door, pushed me past and out of the way, and then they vomited in their front yard. So it was a baptism of fire, but it was actually fantastic. I was around camp, in Hume's company, around with Mark Durkin and many other people, and just got a real sense of a party that had achieved something immense, and it was great to be around.
On one hand, Colum, it's really impressive to see young people involved in politics as young as 14 or whatever age, engaged in that process, exercising their democratic right. I suppose you could look at it another way, which is to say that is there something that we shouldn't be encouraging about young people joining a political party so early, tying yourself to a party, perhaps not giving enough thought to alternative viewpoints? Now, that's not directly at you, obviously, but just this idea of being able to hear voices from across the spectrum as you grow up. And at age 14, it's impossible to get a full grasp of those issues. I mean, did you flirt with other parties, other brands of politics?
Not really. As I say, I was just totally bought into the philosophy and the analysis of the problem and the solution, and I think John got it right. And of course, our main political opponents, I think, were proven wrong in their strategy and tactics around how you change society and how you change the country. So I became more convinced as I went through. I always, though, questioning and critical at times of the party, never kind of fanatical in that way, but convinced about the general thrust of things. I wonder about that, actually, about young people and whether they should be too involved too early. There was never, when I became involved, I don't think I joined the party, as such, for quite a while. I was around the party, and people were always very clear: don't do too much. Don't be. I remember Pat Hume during my GCSEs banning me from canvassing during a particular election, whichever one that was. I obviously ignored her, but anyway, I think she'd have been very cross if she had known I was out knocking doors during my exams. But look, it was, I think young people should keep an open mind and should be broad. I think they should get involved in political activity. We obviously love seeing young people coming into the party, but I don't think a political party should try and tie somebody in at that age. I think they should allow them the opportunity to think very carefully about their allegiances.
And then your next step was you started Latin American studies, I think, at Liverpool. And sorry, this is a cruel joke to make. You maybe should have listened to Pat Hume a little bit more, because as I understand it, you were quite involved in politics and decided not to. You decided to come home anyway. Is that a fair?
Well, yeah, I was very involved in Liverpool in the. I was very involved in the anti-war movement during the Iraq War, and we were students, obviously, and spent an awful lot of time protesting and enjoying ourselves as well. My studies weren't really at the top of my agenda, and that's not something I'm telling people at Queen's to follow. But it was a fairly emotional time around the Iraq War, and we were just very engaged in that. I came home. I wasn't sure really, to be honest. I don't think I ever should have been doing that particular degree course. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And then I was involved again in the party, obviously, and ended up running for election when I was 22, kind of not really supposed to win the seat and won it fairly handily, and that was the end of that.
I mean, it's odd then, because you were involved in, as so many people in that period of time, the anti-war politics and movement, that you would go on to lead what is the sister party to the UK Labour Party, which at that stage was the major political force behind the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. When you were at that age, did you have doubts about the relationship between the SDLP and Labour, or how that relationship would work at all?
I mean, of course, the SDLP MPs voted against the war and argued against it and spoke against it. I remember being very, very angry, actually, with the Labour government. I couldn't understand how a Labour government could do that. I remember going to a Labour Party conference in Blackpool at the time, and made my feelings fairly clear to Tony Blair at an event he had for young people, which didn't go down too well in the hall. But I would imagine, I think I was probably on the side of most Labour Party members at that moment. I think Blair did an awful lot of good. He was a very good Prime Minister. He won 3 elections, probably would have won 4. But and there's a lot you could say about those years. But the Iraq War was, it was devastating for anybody who wanted to see a more just kind of world, and it was just impossible to understand. And I still don't understand how they ended up in that situation. But
let's jump forward in time. You mentioned then getting a seat on the council, and then youngest mayor of Derry in 2007. I asked this of another one of our guests not too long ago. Being that young, is there a vulnerability that comes in there? Was that a daunting experience? Do you look back on it now and say, oh, I wish I was older, I wish I'd waited?
No, actually really enjoyed it. It's probably my favourite ever job in politics. It was fantastic because think it was important. Derry's a very young city. We were going in to bid for the City of Culture in my first week. I chaired the bid team. We presented in Liverpool. We ended up winning. Just a couple of days before that, we had the Savile report being published. I was the mayor for that, and I'd been involved in the Bloody Sunday campaign, and I was a member of the Bloody Sunday Trust and all of that. And it was a momentous kind of time for us, but I think it was important to have somebody young, and it was refreshing actually at that time, because it hadn't really happened before, to have somebody young, kind of leading the city and civically, and it was just a very interesting time. I loved it. I really loved standing up for the people of Derry in that kind of role, which was, I don't think I was very apolitical in the role, but it was less political, I suppose. We had quite a bit of dissident violence at the time, and there was a lot going on. I don't regret it at all, actually, and I think I probably was able to give it a lot more because I didn't have kids and all of that. And it was a fantastic time.
Let me jump, because I was going to come to it at the end, but it's a question relevant to what you just said about young people. A question from Ben. It's safe to say the SDLP has recently placed an emphasis on their younger representatives. Cara Hunter, Matthew O'Toole, Claire Hanna have had the spotlight more than the likes of, well, this person picks out Dolores Kelly, Pat Catney. So my question is, says Ben, how do you combat the brain drain of young professionals in Northern Ireland who are more likely to move to London or out of Northern Ireland than stay and engage with their home communities?
Well, this is something that has driven me for a long time. I know it in Derry more than most, because I think the brain drain is more pronounced here, largely because we don't have a full-size university, and we have been sending young people away. And Northern Ireland as a whole sends, I don't know what this year's figure was, but it's in the thousands of students away. And the figure is 80% of them end up living within 20 miles of the place that they go to university. So we end up losing many of our best and brightest to our economy, to our society, to our families and our communities. And I think that's a real tragedy. And it's one of the things, we have a policy in Northern Ireland, an economic policy called the Mazen Cap, which is the most bizarre policy that any government could pursue. Basically puts a cap on the number of students we have. We don't have enough students coming to Northern Ireland or staying in Northern Ireland. That has a massive impact. And if you speak to investors, the most important thing that they look at, never mind tax, even beyond infrastructure and all of that, is skills. And if we are sending all those people away and they're not coming back, it is having a huge impact on our economy, particularly in areas like Derry that doesn't have that critical mass of student population.
It's the purpose of the cap, no, Colum, that it means that the taxpayer doesn't have a blank check for underwriting certain amounts of tuition fees.
Yeah, but the taxpayer is suffering because we don't have enough income coming into the system, because we don't have the economy that we need. If it's well recognised that alongside infrastructure and a few other things, that skills is the most important thing in attracting investment and allowing Indigenous companies to grow and all of that, then surely what we need is more people, people in jobs, not on the dole, and all of those things, which benefits the taxpayer because they don't have to pay for all of that. So I think it's a fundamental problem that we have in our economy, and it has never been addressed by any government here, and I find it astonishing, to be honest.
So would it be fair to say, just to conclude, that the major policy for you on that one is universities? That's where the problem begins.
I mean, skills are much more than universities, but it is absolutely key that we develop and increase our university capacity. You know what I'll say about that. You start in the place that needs it most, which is the place that's been starved of it since 1964-65, and that's Derry. But we have a very strange system here around how we train people, but I think that is a fundamental weakness in our economy.
Okay. Let's jump back to sort of the journey through Colum Eastwood's life. You took over the party leadership then in 2015. I want to have a chat because a couple of people asked these questions newly into the job, this relationship between you and Mike Nesbitt, between the SDLP and the UUP. You entered an official opposition together. I think you even attended the 2016 UUP party conference to chat. And then that famous line, now whether or not it was one that you regretted at the time, vote me, you get Colum, vote Colum, you get me. Now, well, I remember...
That was Mike's...
Yes, that was Mike's words. No, because I mean, I recall even whether I was during GCSEs or something, there was a lot of talk about how this was a big new moment in Northern Irish politics, a new era of politics, an alternative to the DUP and Sinn Féin. How did that relationship start because it was a new one between the SDLP and the UUP in some ways, between you and Mike Nesbitt?
Yeah, and I think it was largely Mike and I had a very good working relationship. We felt at that time, I remember there'd been a lot of years of DUP, Sinn Féin dominating the executive. We were all in it, but they were dominating it. And I don't think they were treating smaller parties very well. And I think there was an impact then on the community because I think the decision making wasn't very good. And then the opposition bill came in. John McAllister brought in the opposition bill. We worked with them to try and make it as best as it possibly could be. And then I said very clearly before the election that we would use that opposition bill. In other words, we would put our policies in front of the electorate. The electorate will decide, and then we go into negotiation with other parties, so the DUP, Sinn Féin, anybody who was entitled to be in the government. And if we could achieve a certain number of those policies, in a programme for government, then absolutely we would go into government. And I was very honest about that. And I told Martin McGuinness this and others this before we did it. And then we went into the negotiations, and literally they would not negotiate back. No one wanted to speak. We met with all the permanent secretaries, we put in papers, and the negotiations were just basically a shouting match. And it didn't go very well. So we were in a position where we were actually forced into opposition because we entered into a process in good faith. They didn't want to negotiate back. And there was this sense, I think, that because they'd had their own way for so long, that they were going to just bully us into government again, which is a kind of a bizarre thing to say, but they had no interest in any kind of accountability. I don't think they believed that we would go into opposition, but we were left with no choice, so we did. And it made sense, in my view, that we worked with the Ulster Unionists, and I think there was a good relationship there, and we could. And we didn't get an awful lot of time, but the time that we did have, we were beginning to put people under pressure. RHI happened and everything else. We worked closely together on that, and then the whole thing changed, and we were back into that old argument about identity issues, and it made it very difficult for us.
It was raised a couple of times by people. I'm wondering, on one hand, why did you then decide to enter? Can you hear me okay, Colum?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. Why did you then decide to enter back into the executive?
Well, I think largely we had 3 years, of course, of no government, and we had been possibly the strongest advocates of getting the government back up and running. We knew the impact. As bad as the government had been before, no government was a lot worse, and we could see the impact on the schools budget and the health service and everything else. And we felt after NDNA, after all of that, it wasn't the right moment to begin into opposition. The right time was to go into government. And also, and opposition is a tactic, not a principle. It's how you approach your politics. But I also think we achieved quite a lot in the New Decade New Approach Agreement. Now, getting it actually implemented in government is a whole other kettle of fish. But we achieved quite a lot around that negotiating table, and we'll see if it's actually implemented now. But I think it was the right moment to go in after NDNA.
With the problems that you were just talking about prescribing seconds ago to do with dominance, Sinn Féin, are they fixed now, or is it the same problems there? Yeah, well,
no, they're not. That's the truth. And we are giving it our best. I think Nicola Mallon is a very good minister. You can see she's very active. She's trying to turn around a department and trying to make an impact, particularly around things like climate change. But it's very difficult. I mean, we have to be honest about that. The DUP and Sinn Féin still believe, I think, in their own dominance of that executive. And I would just caution them to be careful about all of that, because there are also parties that are very worried about proper accountability. We're trying to do our bit in the executive and to hold them to account and everything else, and to try and make things better for society. But I mean, that's not a blank check. That's not open-ended. We'll see how we go, but we won't be bullied.
I know you're putting maybe a good face on it, Colin, because you were punished, now whether for this reason or other ones, at the polls. 2 pretty disastrous results: 2017 Assembly election and then general election. I'm just wondering what that says about this idea of working together across the aisle.
Well, first of all, I don't think they're connected, but I also don't think, in terms of the assembly election, we were punished. I think our numbers stayed the same in a reduced assembly. So all the six seaters became five seaters, and we ended up with the same number of seats, which I think in that very, very difficult climate. And if you can remember back, it was very hot and heavy. It was very DUP v Sinn Féin, and Martin McGuinness dying. That was a very, very difficult election. And but I think we held our own and did quite well, actually. The Westminster election wasn't good. Pretty clear that wasn't good. We were very honest about that. We lost 3 seats in within the space of half an hour, and it was very difficult. But I don't think that was to do with. I don't think it was to do with us not been in kind of partnership with the Ulster Unionist Party. It was more to do with the climate at the time. Very difficult, all related back to Brexit actually, but very, very difficult to try to cut through with a sensible argument in that moment.
You mentioned the general election, and I want to kind of talk about that. What happened in Foyle in 2017 is my first question, because I was looking at the stats again today. I mean, that was the seat held by the SDLP since its creation. It had never even really been close. And your candidate, Mark Durkan, lost by fewer than 200 votes. Was it complacency that year? What was the cause of that? Because then you won it back, and in your defence, you now have a seat. What is it? A 17,000 seat majority, one of the highest in the UK. What was the cause of that disastrous loss in 2017?
Well, be careful what I say, but I think there were big irregularities around proxy voting and some other things, but that's not new. But we were very clear that there were issues there, and I think the Electoral Office have resolved some of those issues, but some still exist. And I think we would have won without that, but the margin still would have been a lot smaller than it should have been. A large part, this is largely to do with the emotion around, I think, Martin McGuinness dying, and the anger at Arlene Foster around RHA and the crocodiles and all of that. And you have to put yourself back in that place. It was a very, very emotional time, and very difficult for kind of a common sense argument to cut through the middle. And people just were wanting to, frankly, punish the DUP. And that was one way in which they did it. I never believed it was permanent. I never believed that we wouldn't get it back, and we could see a route back through the council elections, where we did very well, and then obviously on to the Westminster election in 19, where we weren't really expecting an election to come that quick, but when it came, we were ready. We did an awful lot of work on the ground to be ready for that. And I mean, I think the people spoke very clearly in that election.
Don't worry, I will get to 2019 when it all seems a bit brighter. I just want to focus on 2017. I know it's awful for a minute. Did you think about? I know. Did you think about resigning at all at that time? Yeah,
I did, surely.
And why didn't you? I suppose because if you had, people could have easily said, "Well, that kind of makes sense."
Oh yeah, no, I would have understood it. I had, over that particular weekend, I spent a lot of time thinking and speaking to friends, and I wrote the resignation letter, a resignation statement, but I never issued it, and I was very honest at the time that I thought about it. Because I felt that you have to be responsible as a leader for bad elections, but then I also believed that we could turn it around, and that there were things that we could do, and that we were. You have to remember, the SDLP were a very low ebb for a long time, and we were only beginning to rebuild. And in the north, it takes a long time to change people's perception of you. We also had election after election after election. We never had a break. And I think we needed a bit of time to regroup and regather and get people to look at us again. And that's what we ended up doing. So I decided that it was better to stay and fight and to continue. And I knew I had a route and a pathway to actually getting us back on our feet again.
How close were you, Colum? I mean, was it a finger hovering over the send button, or did it never quite get that far?
Well, I mean, I thought about it, for a day or two, and well, you don't have very long, and I analysed the election result. I came to the conclusion that yes, there were things we could have done better, but we were in an atmosphere that was almost impossible to fight against, and we were hearing that Unionists were just wanting to vote for the DUP everywhere, no matter what, and Nationalists just wanted to vote for Sinn Féin. It was just that kind of the worst version of our politics was at the fore, and parties like ours weren't gonna prosper in the middle of that. And I felt that we had a route back to victory, and we would just get on with the job. And I made the decision, and then that was the end of that, and got stuck in again.
Of course, then we'll jump forward to 2019, and the success was achieved there. One of the questions that was sent into us on the back of that was the SDLP result in 2019 a one-off success based on anti-Brexit sentiment?
No, I don't think so. And if you look at the council elections in certain areas, we were beginning to build. There's a lot more to do. We're not at all complacent, and we're building now towards the next election next year. And you'll have seen us bringing in Cara Hunter, Sinead McLaughlin, Matthew O'Toole, and we're putting people forward in front and centre who are young and talented and new. And we needed that. We needed to freshen up. But just before that, Claire Hanna was brought in, Nicola Mallon was brought. Our top team now is young and fresh and different. It's a new generation with new things to say. So that was a big part of the work that we were engaged in doing. And elections kept getting in the way, but we then got a bit of space to do it. The Brexit context, of course, helped. Because we had in places like Derry, we had an MP who wouldn't turn up to vote against Brexit, which I think people found just astonishing. Also, the Assembly being down and people's frustration, that was all wrapped up in it. But I do think also people were beginning to look again at us. And Claire Hanna is a fantastic candidate and now a fantastic MP. And people were able to unite around her in South Belfast. I think we had a very broad coalition of voters in Derry. I mean, if you look at some of the tallies in places where we got very, very high votes, I mean, people would have been shocked, and they kept telling us before the election it was going to be very tight. I think within a couple of days of the election being called, we knew we were going to win, but we didn't know it was going to, and we thought it was going to be quite big, but we didn't think it was going to be that big, obviously. But we don't take any of that for granted, and we know some of those votes are loaned and all of that, but we do think we have the basis of building something. I also think in Southdown, if we had more time, we could have taken that seat. And Margaret's decision kind of didn't give us much space and time to get ready. But that's in the sights for the next time. But the big challenge now is the Assembly election next year. I think we put in a very good show.
You mentioned Margaret Ritchie. One of the questions that we were sent. Let's see if I can hunt it out here. Yes, question. One of your predecessors as party leader, Margaret Ritchie, accepted a peerage from Theresa May in Theresa May's resignation honours list. She's now, I think, Baroness Ritchie of Downpatrick. The question was, would you ever accept a peerage to the House of Lords?
No, absolutely not.
And what did you think of now Baroness Ritchie's decision to accept a peerage to the House of Lords?
Well, Margaret is somebody who's done her bit and deserves to make whatever decision is right for her. It's obviously not compatible with kind of membership of the SDLP because we totally oppose the House of Lords, and it's not for us. I get on very well with Margaret. I still do, and I was always a big supporter of Margaret. And Margaret made her own decision in her own time, and I don't bear I have no difficulty with that, really. I personally would not ever enter the House.
Do you work at all with Baroness Ritchie between the Lords and the Commons? Because at the time, part of her justification for taking it was that it was an extra voice for Irish nationalism. Actually, one where there are probably no voices for Irish nationalism in the House of Lords in particular, and that every additional voice was worthwhile. Do you work at all with her across? I mean, is she part of any sort of SDLP parliamentary grouping or anything like that?
No, but we do work together, and with other lords as well, because the system is the system. We have to work the system, and there are people, particularly in the Labour side, who we work very closely with, and legislation is kind of very heavily scrutinised by the House of Lords, and I meet Margaret fairly regularly when I'm in Westminster, and Margaret's a very diligent and hard-working person. We have a disagreement about the House of Lords, and that's fine, but But she's a very hard worker, and no matter where she is, she'd be working on behalf of the people here.
Mhm.
Never, the one thing I think people would understand about Margaret, people who know her, it would never be about her. She wouldn't have taken a peerage for herself. She's just not that kind of person. She genuinely believes that she can be a voice for Irish nationalism in the House of Lords, and that's fair enough.
Let's stay in the Commons then. There was a lot of talk at the time, partly because of what you've already mentioned, this abstentionist policy of Sinn Féin. In order to become an MP, you have to swear allegiance to the Queen, her heirs and successors. Now, you swore it by saying that it was one, under protest, and two, that your true allegiance was to the people of Ireland, but you still swore the allegiance.
Well, I made an affirmation, which is different.
Yeah. Okay. Does that issue matter to you at all as a point of principle, or do you really just not care?
No, I do care. I mean, I really didn't want to say those words. By the way, I've bear no ill will to anybody who does have allegiance to the Queen. That's for them, and that's grand. But I don't. So it was, and that's why we affirmed, because I couldn't swear a lie. And I think if you look at how I said it, it was pretty clear I was saying it under protest, as other people do as well, and pretty clear at the end that my true allegiance was to the people of Ireland and Derry, or people of Derry and Ireland. I can't remember what I said, but I mean, it's something. As somebody once said, it's an empty formula, and it has to be said in order to represent the people who I represent. And people of Derry knew that was an issue that we had to get over in order to represent them, and they decided they wanted representation, and I think that's the most important thing. So politics is all about principle is very important, but it's all, you can't always get hung up on a few words if it's going to stop you representing the people. And I was, to be honest, frankly, I found it very difficult to watch the DUP being the only voice from Northern Ireland in the House of Commons during those very important 2 years. And we've seen the impact that has had, and it's having today, because of Brexit and how Brexit is being done. So I found that frankly excruciating to watch, and I'm really glad now that we have three of us, actually. So you have myself and Claire and Stephen Farry in there, showing people that there is an alternative to the DUP speaking for the North. And actually a lot of people, a lot of MPs from other parties are very glad to see other people coming from Ireland.
I want to return to this Brexit issue and the value of being there, I guess. I just want to indulge ever so slightly. For many politics students, I suppose, Colin, being elected to a parliament is a dream come true. Now, it wasn't parliament that you wanted to be in, perhaps, but no. Is there still kind of a first day of school thrill to arriving in the Commons?
Look, I never wanted to be an MP. I have to be honest about that. It was never something that was in my my plan, if ever there was a plan. But it's something that arrived, and decided that it was the right moment and the right move at that particular time. It is a fascinating place. I mean, I don't see it really as my parliament. All due respect to people who do, that's fine. But I have a job to do, and my job is to try to hold the British government to account and to represent the voices of people who haven't been represented. I think we do that quite well. But in terms of coming into the Commons, it's a big place. It's a very impressive place. It really is kind of against a lot of my core beliefs, but it is fascinating, and the standard of debate is very high. Not always, but there's a lot of very good people in the Commons, and it is an interesting place to be, and it's big and it's broad, and you do get to talk about issues that maybe...
Was it better than you thought?
Assembly. I think it is better than I thought. Surprisingly, I enjoy it. I don't know if I enjoy it, but I enjoy the kind of theatre of the chamber and all of that. Again, I don't want to be there forever. I'd rather be somewhere else, but that's kind of beside the point. I do enjoy the fact that you can talk about international affairs and everything else, and the Assembly can be a bit dull at times, but Westminster is far from dull, and it's a big platform, and it's a platform that I think our people should have, and we were starved of it for
let me ask you this, because this came from Aaron. Do you have any regrets about leaving the Assembly, taking on a role as an MP in a parliament dominated, he says, by the Tories? At the next Assembly election, are you going to run or stay as an MP?
No, I'm not going to run for the next Assembly election. We have a fantastic team led by Nicola in the Assembly, and I think it's good for a political party to have people in different places with different platforms. And we see Westminster as a platform to raise the case for the people we represent, and I'll continue to do that for as long as the people of Derry are happy to.
But would you rather be in the Assembly, I guess?
Okay, for me, it's not really about that. It's kind of you go where you need to go in that particular moment. As I say, it was never the plan. It was never the plan to go to Westminster at all. But that's where I am, and I think the people of Derry and people who aren't the DUP. I don't just mean Northern Nationalists. I think people who aren't in the DUP need representation in the House of Commons, and I'm happy to go and do it. And I think I do a reasonable job when I'm over there. So I'm happy with the team we have in Stormont, and I'm happy with the team we have in Westminster, and we'll continue to broaden that team. But no, I'm going to stay where I am.
Let me ask, now this was a question, perhaps unsurprisingly, because I'm sure you hear it a lot, that was submitted to us along the lines of, "Hey, Colum, have you stopped Brexit yet?"
I love that one.
You can answer that if you want. I'm probably more interested in knowing, you must have known, because Brexit was front and center of your campaigning, obviously, for that 2019 election. I think I even dug out some of your campaign things that I have a nasty habit of keeping everybody's. And stop Brexit, and that is very in there. Was it foolish to tie yourself to something that would be ultimately impossible to deliver? Because it was becoming clear leading up to that election that the wind was only blowing in one direction.
Well, I always find it fascinating. Every time I say anything on Twitter, I get, "Have you stopped Brexit?" by Sinn Féin trolls, who of course could have voted to stop Brexit, or at least to have a soft Brexit in the 17 to 19 Parliament, and didn't, and we lost. Votes were lost there by 3 votes on a couple of occasions, and I think Sinn Féin sitting on their hands and in the House didn't really help. We never said we were going to stop Brexit on our own. And that was fairly clear. I was in every interview I did. We were absolutely clear that we would be part of a coalition who would always vote against Brexit, and always vote if Brexit was going to happen, to mitigate the worst excesses of it. That's what we tried to do. Did I want Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister? Absolutely not. I wanted to see a Labour-led government, preferably one that had a few other parties in it as well. But it didn't happen, and that's elections. People in Northern Ireland did their bit, but people in England didn't, and people in Scotland voted against Brexit as well. That was the result of the election, but there's only so much I can do about that.
Part of the reason I ask is because at Queen's we've just had the student union elections, and I've been thinking a lot about the purpose of manifestos. When you sit down to write a manifesto, is a manifesto a promise? Is it a statement of intent? Is it a broad outline of kind of perspective and lofty ambition? When you write one, what's in your head?
Well, I think what it is if we had all the power, this is exactly what we would do. And if we don't get all the power, these are the aims that we will still try to work towards. And I suppose if you look at our manifestos, we will vote along these lines, no matter how much power or not we have. I don't think anybody thought that at the very most we were going to get 3 elected. I don't think anybody thought I was going to be Prime Minister, or that I didn't even want to. So they're a ridiculous thing to suggest. So we were always going to use whatever power or influence we had. And remember, the DUP not long before had an awful lot of power and wasted it, in my view. So we were prepared, and we still are, to vote against Brexit and everything else, and we did all those things. Would we have loved to see a Labour government? Yes. A hung parliament? Yes. Just the ability to stop what I think is a generations-long damaging project, which is Brexit, and is having a hugely destabilising impact on people here. And bizarrely, the party who had all of the power used it in such a way where they followed the right wing of the Tory party, the ERG, and we ended up in a scenario where nobody wanted, which was a border in the Irish Sea, because they weren't prepared to vote for a soft Brexit. And that shows you how using your influence badly and having no strategic thinking That's where that gets you, and I think the DUP, will be punished for that in the long term.
Let's talk about that directly, because a lot of questions came up, unsurprisingly, about the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. Some of them along the lines of, did you underestimate the strength of feeling amongst unionist communities over what the Northern Ireland Protocol would cause, which is Northern Ireland being treated differently from the rest of the UK? Did you not think that it would be bad as it has now turned out to be?
It wasn't my agreement. Of course, it was the British government and the European Commission's agreement, and it was. I mean, I think we just have to step back a bit, because this is.
You did argue in favour of its full implementation.
Yes, absolutely, because there's no choice.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to step back, and I'm not saying this because I want to rub anybody's nose in or anything else. I just think if you get rid of the protocol, we have to look at what the alternatives are. So remember, Boris Johnson during the referendum campaign never argued for a hard Brexit. He always said that we can keep the trading side of it. He never wanted to leave the customs union and single market. And then, of course, they've left the customs union and single market, cheered on by the DUP, which, when you think about it, is absolutely bizarre. Because once Britain leaves the customs union and single market, there have to be checks somewhere, because they're going into a different economic zone and trading relationship to the European Union. We know there's a border in Ireland with a land border with the European Union, so the border would have had to be there. That was totally unpalatable politically, but even if it wasn't, it was impractical. 20,000 British troops couldn't man that border. The idea that a few border posts would do it, and all of the implications of that. So it was always going to be the case that if Britain decided on a hard Brexit, which they have, then there would have to be checks at ports. The DUP knew this because we pointed it out to them time and time and time again. So this wasn't our
Colum, that doesn't really, with respect, that doesn't really help, maybe somebody who feels British, is loyalist, lives in Larne or wherever they live, and is looking at the situation that has emerged. I mean, that's all well and good for pointing the finger at the DUP, but I'm just wondering.
It's genuinely not about that. I'll tell you why I say it because there's a large campaign being mounted now by unionist parties and others to scrap the protocol. But what does that mean? Where does that end? I mean, Jim Allister at least is honest about it. He said we'll put the border on the land. We'll have a hard border in Ireland. Well, that's one position. I don't think most people who are British, who feel British and are upset by this, and I understand that they're upset by this. I get that totally. But that doesn't solve their problem, because most people don't want that either, because they know there's implications to that as well. And the only way to do this was to either avoid Brexit or avoid them leaving the customs union and single market. But I also say this very clearly to people who are British and who are very worried about this and who are genuinely worried about the Good Friday Agreement. I'm not talking about the DUP in this, because they don't care about the Good Friday Agreement, and they're talking about it every day now as if they wrote it and didn't protest against it for years. But I say this genuinely to them: there is no changed constitutional position until people vote for it. Until I can convince enough people to vote for it, it doesn't change. So if you think strategically about this, unionism should not, I don't think, enter into a big debate about this, a big campaign about this, because they will lose out. And if recent history or further back history tells us anything, Boris Johnson is going to let you down. He is not going to scrap this protocol. We can fix some of the issues, some of the trading issues. We've already fixed some of them. If people calm down and work through the process, that can all be done. But we have to be honest, there are going to be changes because we're in a different trading bloc now than Britain, and that's just a reality. And if I was the DUP, I would have used my time in power with the Tories to argue for a soft Brexit. They didn't do that, and that's where we are. So, but I totally and absolutely understand how ordinary unionists feel. I didn't want this either. We didn't want this. I want open borders right across these islands. That's the best way to trade. But this is a result. It's a practical response to a hard Brexit. There literally is no other choice once a hard Brexit is chosen.
Let me ask something before we move on. You've said that the position of Northern Ireland doesn't change unless there's obviously through consent. Why is it okay for nationalists to find a border on the island of Ireland unpalatable, but not as okay for loyalists to find a border down the Irish Sea unpalatable?
It's not about that, though. There's this kind of notion being put out there now that somebody in the European Commission decided, well, it's easier to annoy unionists than it is to annoy nationalists. It's just not the case. Let's just for 1 second park the political reality and the peace process reality about what a hard border in Ireland would do, even if you set that aside, even that wasn't an issue, who's going to man every one of the 300 plus border crossings? I mean, from a mile from here, there's probably 5. Who's going to man all of those? This isn't as if Northern Ireland is connected to the Republic of Ireland through one big bridge. I mean, this is not how this place works. Who's going to man it? Who's going to check it? Who's going to feel comfortable that the single market hasn't been infected? These are economic and trading realities that I think it's just as it is. I mean, we haven't created this problem. We'd like to fix it. We'd like to minimise it as much as possible. None of this would be an issue. If a lot of this could be resolved, by the way, tomorrow, if the British government decided to do a veterinary agreement with the European Commission. Many of the checks wouldn't have to happen in that regard, but they still are driving, and they're being supported by Sammy Wilson and the rest of them. They still are driving towards this notion, this utopian notion, that they're going to be able to go around the world and trade in very good terms. So I think that's largely been ruptured because Joe Biden is now president and all of that. But it is a bizarre approach to say we want a hard Brexit, but we also don't want checks on the border at the ports, and we also don't want a hard border. It has to be one of those three.
Okay, let me ask you one final thing before we move on to, because a lot of people have asked questions about a United Ireland as well, and I know you want to talk about that as well. Let me ask you, it's a quote from Claire Hanna. You'll know this, it's not new. Party colleague, fellow MP from just before the election. Quote, if 60% of people do not want a border on the island of Ireland and you say, tough shit, we are putting you inside a hard border, you cannot expect people to choke that down and get on with their lives. You cannot imagine that people would take that without civil disobedience at the very minimum. Now, that's not a new quote. You will have heard that before. My question is it not language like that, Colum, that has allowed loyalist paramilitaries, for example, to believe that by threatening violence, they can achieve their goal, which is to axe the NI protocol?
I don't think so, because, and I'm happy to speak to anybody about the realities of this. So on one hand, you have unionist parties saying, some of them saying we want to fix these problems, and others saying they want to scrap the protocol. Well, you can't fix and scrap something at the same time. But nobody, I would love someone, we had alternatives, by the way, to a hard border in Ireland. It was Theresa May's deal, which I would have supported. The protocol was another alternative. No Brexit, pretty good alternative. And a soft Brexit was the best way of doing this. If you wanted to have your political Brexit, if you were from that position, you could have had a political Brexit, but not a trade Brexit, but they didn't do it. So I ask all these people when they're campaigning and threatening and doing all these things, that's fine, that's their right to oppose something, but what is the actual alternative? Because you have to have one. You can't just say you want to scrap one, because that'll end up in a very unsuccessful strategy. And I think unionism should look back upon the past number of decades as to how this all ended up. Sunningdale, Anglo-Irish Agreement, the DUP opposing the Good Friday Agreement. Where did that all end up? You're better in the room, working through the process, solving the problems, making people feel comfortable and working together. There is no alternative to partnership and all of that. And I think
I get that. My question is just that has using the threat, and that whether you call it a threat or you call it, what some people perceive as being a reality, that there would be civil disobedience at the border. That was part of the reason why the European Union was so keen to ensure that there was no border on the island of Ireland. My point is do you have any regrets about that language being used, because it is now legitimizing loyalist paramilitaries doing exactly the same thing in the other direction?
I think that's a big jump to say that that's legitimizing anything. I think it was a statement of fact, and there's a difference between protest, civil disobedience, and violence. And as you know, we've been opposed to violence since our inception, but we also, just to look at history, what happened on the border, over many years. So we know that would have been a very difficult thing to manage. And even if you could avoid all that, it would have even greater trade disruption than we're having right now, which I think has been exaggerated as well. But it would have been impossible to police that border in terms of checking goods. It just wasn't possible. And all of the great brains and the right wing of the Tory party and the DUP, none of them could come up with an alternative arrangement. They just couldn't come up with one that was ever going to stand up to scrutiny. So this is why we're in the situation of the protocol. We didn't want it. That's where we are. I would have much preferred no Brexit. If we had to have a Brexit, we could have had a soft Brexit. And by the way, they could still re-enter the customs union and single market if they wanted. But nobody within unionism, I now see Steve Aiken is sort of beginning to say it, but support for a veterinary agreement would solve a lot of these problems. But it won't solve the core issue around identity. And I accept that, I understand it, that we're now in a different trading relationship. I totally get that. But I don't know what to do about that because I didn't argue for it. I argued against it and I've tried to mitigate it ever since. And those people who argue for it have to own it. And the best way to do that is not to wind people up and tell them there's a solution at the other end of this. And I think a lot of this is driven by the DUP's guilty conscience because they got us into this mess. But they shouldn't be lying to their own people and saying this can be solved. There will be difference. There will be new supply chains. All of that will happen. Okay. We can resolve as many of these issues as possible, but the best thing to do is sit down, work together. I don't ever remember in the history of the north of Ireland there being another solution other than sitting down and talking to each other.
Okay. Problems. Yes. We actually, you mentioned Ian Blackford earlier. We had Ian Blackford to chat and we asked him about the border, a potential border between Scotland and England. And he said that in Northern Ireland, more attention should have been given to the idea of technology at the border because that solution could then be used between Scotland and England, which I'm sure is something that some people will want to look into. I want to talk about a United Ireland, Colum. We got sort of two big sort of sections here. Let me read out a question from Jasmine, first of all, which is more kind of structural or constitutional. What would a united or new Ireland ideally look like to you? Would Stormont remain a governing body of a region? How would unionist parties fit into the Dáil? And how would we create a united Ireland for all?
Well, I suppose first of all, we will announce the next couple of weeks our membership of our New Ireland Commission, which will be basically a lot of experts in different fields looking at policy, and we'll work through all of these big questions. But I think the core of the question that Jasmine has asked is basically, does the Good Friday Agreement remain post-constitutional change? So does Stormont remain? I think it does. I think it should. We have grown up, as much as I want to see a United Ireland and New Ireland, we've grown up differently and we've grown at different paces and in different ways. And I think there is a very strong case for Stormont remaining, obviously in a different way. But I firmly believe in the protections of the Good Friday Agreement for minorities. And I would want to see those in whatever form that would take within a United Ireland as well. And I think we need to look at all those things. We need to challenge ourselves as Irish nationalists. I think we're going to have a big job to challenge people in Dublin and the South around some of the changes that they're going to have to make. But we can't all be rhetorical about our, republicanism. We have to be on it. We have to be genuine about uniting the people of this island. And that will take big compromise. It'll take big changes in how the island is ordered. Mm-hmm. And that will be challenging for a lot of people. But that is a conversation that I think is worth having. And should it be an Ireland for all? Absolutely. It's not worth having otherwise.
We got a question from essentially from Jasmine, from Hugh, from Ciara, and from somebody else as well, all around the idea of how you engage with unionists at the point that you've just made. There seems to be, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, we regularly in these kind of conversations talk about the importance of having the conversation. If you had to design the system right now, I mean, what about things like Ireland joining the Commonwealth? What about 12th of July? What about Remembrance Day? Because you're a smart guy, and the SDLP is full of very bright people who engage with unionists all the time. You have a rough idea of the kind of stuff that would need to be in a new Ireland.
Yes, I do, and we think about it all the time, as you say, and we will release documents about all those things in the next wee while. But I think it's not a good idea to start a conversation by telling people what you think they want. So we have tasked all of our elected representatives to go out into their local communities and, for want of a better term, go and speak to some unionists and have a conversation with them. Not in a kind of a imposing your views idea, but literally just get a sense of where people are at. The issue for us is that unionist political parties are not engaging. I think that's a mistake on their part, but it's also their right. So we're involved in multiple levels of dialogue with different people from across the community. We will enhance and expand that over the next few months. We are speaking and we're engaging with experts to form this New Ireland Commission where we'll go through all of this. But like, I have certain views around that. I do think we need to find ways of embracing unionist culture, unionist identity, Britishness in a way that has not been done in the 26 counties since its foundation. You talk about the 12th of July. Well, I remember standing with John Hume at the, I don't know what age I was, 16 or 17, watching the apprentice boys coming around the city centre in Derry, which was always a very emotive event in the city. And I was saying something stupid like, what are they doing here, whatever, really young and stupid. And John said, well, how can we have a United Ireland if we can't accommodate the apprentice boys in Derry? Because Derry is basically a microcosm of what a New Ireland would look like in terms of demographics. And it just stuck with me because we need to be very open and honest that people of a different view exist, live here, are a hugely important part of the culture, and we can't have a kind of we can't do in a New Ireland what was done in the first 50 years of the new Northern Ireland. We have to be, I think, almost over the top in terms of our generosity to make people feel comfortable. But I would love unionist people, whether unionist parties or not, do this. Unionist people to think about what they would like and to help co-design that with us. And that doesn't mean we're going to turn unionists into nationalists. They can vote whatever way they want, but we should have a conversation about if it was going to happen, how it would look. And just in the same way, we've worked very actively over many years to make Northern Ireland better and make it more welcoming and more accommodating and more fair and just and to have protections for minorities. We have to do that same work.
There are two kind of things, Colum, that I maybe hear from people in response to that. One is some unionists feel as if entering into this conversation is a bit of a trick because they believe that they are being used in order to, to say, oh, well, we're having those conversations with unionists and they don't want to have any part in a New Ireland, and why should they have that conversation? I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And the other one is, none of this actually needs to happen. All that a United Ireland needs is 51%. So I ask you, what are the prerequisites for the SDLP before even having a border poll?
Well, first of all, in any democracy, it's 50% plus one. That's the way it is. But that's not what I want. I want as much buy-in as possible, because you're not just talking about and some people think like this, we need to win a referendum. It's not about winning a referendum. It's about building a nation and building, as Seamus Mallon talked about, the shared home place where people feel comfortable and confident within themselves, within their identity, whatever that happens to be, but that we can have a better, from my perspective, constitutional setup. So, that's, and the other thing people need to remember is the British government hold all the cards in this. They decide when the referendum occurs, which I think is a pretty bad thing, because this particular British government will not do whatever is right for the people here. They will do what suits them. The first part of that question was, will unionists or should unionists engage? I can tell you they are engaging already. Just ordinary unionist people are speaking to us and are interested. They're not changing who they are, but they want to know our view on things. And I think we should view this in a different way than United Ireland or not. This is actually, do people have a positive, in my view, the best way to have this conversation is, do unionist people have a positive perspectives for the United Kingdom? And do people who want to see constitutional change have a positive perspective for a United Ireland, for want of a better term? And let's have a discussion and a debate and all of that. Now, we all have to do our work on that first, but I think that's, 22 or whatever years after the Good Friday Agreement, I think that's that's something I think we would have expected to be doing about now. And there's nothing wrong with that.
If you had to put a timeline, Colum, do you want to see a border poll in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? That's my first question. And my second one is, just quantify for us a little bit more. Do you want to see like a big white paper that says, here's the plan for a New Ireland that is published before anything goes anywhere?
Well, in terms of timing, I avoid that because I think we have the referendum when we're ready to have it. And again, it's not up to us, it's up to the British government. And I think some from the nationalist perspective need to be very careful about what they're asking for, because I want a referendum that we're going to win. I don't want one that we're going to lose, and all the implications that has. And the British government have it within their gift to call an early election, a referendum if they want, which I think would be bad for those of us who want to try and change the constitution. What was your second question? Sorry.
Would you want like a white paper?
Yeah, well, we're going to do that. You will see the SDLP publishing discussion papers, not as kind of this is it, over a long period, over a period of months and years, and asking people to engage with those papers and those ideas, and we'll be listening to other people's perspectives on it and everything else. And at the end, I think yes, we need to have a blueprint. If you look at what the Scottish National Party did at the referendum, in the nearly 1,000 pages of a document, lots of things worked out, still didn't win. So I think there's an awful lot of work to be done. We're going to engage in that work. We're already engaged in it. We're going to expand it and involve more people. And I think it's exciting. I mean, I genuinely think my generation has an opportunity to change things. And, you think about the generation that brought the Good Friday Agreement, they had an awful lot of work to do just to bring peace. And that was it. I think we should be entitled to demand a bit more than that, and to have prosperity and peace, yes, reconciliation, and an open society. I mean, I just frankly don't want to live in a place that its politics is governed by English nationalism. I'd rather be part of the European Union and part of something that is global and progressive and connected, not driven by this kind of crazy notion that Boris Johnson has, an understanding of the world. I think we're in a different place here.
I want to move on to a couple of other serious points, but I always like to throw in a lighthearted one. A question we were sent. Question: when did Colum discover that he had a white patch in his beard? That's the question.
Well, I think the patch came along when I was in my early 20s. I don't know, it literally just overnight it was there, but I hadn't had a stubble, but I never had a beard until I went on holidays and decided I'm just going to grow this thing and see what happens. And I got home and I remember my mother saying to me, when we got home from holidays, you're either dyeing that or shaving it now. So that was the stubborn person.
Because I've seen branding. Is it SDLP Youth branding maybe that has the white patch in it? Logos or something. Are there serious conversations that go on in boardrooms about how you're going to marketize the beard?
Oh God, there's people paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to think about that sort of stuff,
Okay. Let's talk about a serious issue we were sent in. The question, simply put, is SDLP a pro-life party or a pro-choice party? I'll let you answer that first.
Well, I think there isn't a normal, use the word carefully, a normal Democratic Party in the democratic world that doesn't have members who have different views on this issue, and most of them allow a conscience vote. So we got to that position that we would allow a conscience position for our elected representatives. I think it's a very healthy thing, and I just don't think it's possible actually to manage a political party when people have divergent views on something that's a moral issue, and that's fair enough. The Alliance Party have a conscience position. I think the Ulster Unionist Party do. Sinn Féin don't. The DUP don't, and I think Sinn Féin have had some difficulty with that because they try to enforce a position on people, and so yes, we are. I suppose we had two motions on that particular day at the special conference. One which passed was we're a pro-life party, and the other passed that we allow people to use their conscience. So that's, I suppose that's the position.
What somebody would, I mean, you said that Sinn Féin enforcing or the DUP enforcing that policy. So what one person's enforcement of a policy is another person's, principle and some form of, that. I mean, for example, you wouldn't let somebody into your party probably if they didn't believe in a United Ireland or if they weren't some way Republican. So I mean,
it's a very different issue though, and it's recognised as such around the world, by democratic parties. I mean, the idea that everybody in Sinn Féin agrees on abortion, well, it's pretty farcical. Same goes for the DUP. There are DUP MLAs who I know have a different view than the party on that, and I just think that's unmanageable. I don't think it's fair. I think society and communities are split on this issue. It's a very difficult and very sensitive issue. Very few people are black and white on it. Lots of people have different views at different times on different issues, and I think that just has to be accommodated. And I think legislators should be entitled to come to their own view when they look at the evidence, and that's what I've done. Others have done, and that's normal in any democratic society.
As a final point on this, what is the purpose in having a party policy that you're a pro-life policy if you're going to allow conscience voting? What's the point in having a policy that isn't really a policy? Because what the critics would say is that what you're doing is just trying to cover yourself for both constituencies.
No, if you were doing that, you would just have a conscience position, which I could have imposed just a conscience position, but I decided to allow the membership and encourage the membership to get together and come up with the policy, and they're the two positions that passed. I think it's perfectly acceptable. Like 2 days after our internal conference was out supporting repeal the 8th in the south, and I've spoken about abortion in different ways. Others have as well. Others have different views. Perfectly acceptable. I'm very comfortable as a party leader that people can have their own views, and you'll see that over the next few weeks that people have different views on certain aspects of government policy, and I think that's fair enough.
Okay, I want to ask a question on a not unrelated issue off the back of the real tragedy in England this week from Corsiena. What is the SDLP's legislative plan to protect and support women who've been assaulted? Conscience Cause, she says, is actively limiting the rights and the respect and rights of women who've been violated, so therefore control of their body has already been stripped. More than often, it's the legal system and victim blaming culture of the courtroom that leads to few prosecutions, meaning that the person with the lasting repercussions of the assault is the victim. Basically, what changes would you make in order to try to protect women against the kind of thing that happened this week?
Yeah, I mean, it's just utterly tragic and just horrible to watch. And what's even worse, not even worse, but what has also been highlighted this week is all of the women coming forward and explaining how, and it's a vast majority of women in our society, explaining how they've all had different experiences of harassment and abuse, and how society then kind of blames them for it, and that needs addressed. I joined the Women's Aid campaign this week or last week, whenever it was, for a strategy. We don't have a strategy for violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland. I think that's wrong. It exists in other parts of these islands, but we don't have it here. And I think that needs to be addressed. Most of the violence against women happens in the home, and it's just not good enough that we don't have a government policy or strategy around it. In terms of, I think the questioner was addressing the issue of rape and abortion. I mean, I'm very clear from my perspective that abortion should absolutely be allowed in the case of rape, and that is now the case, thankfully. Although there are major issues about Robin Swan, frankly, not bringing in, not commissioning those services. And I would not be shocked if Westminster have to legislate around that in the coming months, and I think they should.
Does that not sit a bit awkwardly, though, Colum, with him? You say that you allow your members and you allow your MLAs a conscience vote on this, and then you also say, no, this is a really important issue, and you value it personally, and you want Robin Swan to be making changes on this. I mean, surely if this is a policy that you believe in, the thing to do would be to start at home and enact it in your own party.
Well, I will always make arguments and have debates and try and convince people of a particular view, but I won't in something like a moral issue like this. And like every other party, more or less on the planet, have a conscience position on these issues. I think it's pretty normal, and it's also an acceptance of the fact that people in our society have different views on this, and it's impossible to impose your view. I'm giving you my view. It's a view I've voted on, a view I've argued for. I've spoken to Robin Swan about this. The reality of what we have at the minute, because of the fact that we haven't commissioned the services, is that in the middle of a pandemic, people can't travel, and we end up in a situation where everybody says they don't want, where abortion pills are the only mechanism for people to get an abortion. I don't think that's fair or right, especially when it's the law that people should be entitled to access that service. And I have had God knows how many protests outside my office because of taking this position. That's fine, and people are entitled to their own view on it. I'm entitled to mine, and I think we should protect individuals' right to have those different views. And I'll always argue that everybody's entitled to their view in this, and I don't see it as black and white. I think we have to protect people's opportunity to have different views. Okay. And people can have different views on the different elements of this as well. But
a final thing on this, I promise, because I want to finish up because you've been very good and you've given your time. I mean, is there not something unusual though? I mean, you've talked about you've said there, how much you put on the line to do with this, and you really believe in this policy. I mean, by-election in West Tyrone 2018, one of your candidates campaigned on the idea of being pro-life under the SDLP banner. How does that sit with you being the leader and being, as you say, very passionately in favour of one perspective on this?
Well, I mean, again, that particular candidate was entitled to his view, as everybody else's, and I will defend anybody's right to have a different view from myself, and I think that's fair enough. And I think we're a wee bit behind the times, really, here in assuming, because I think we assume that every political party in the world has one view, and it's just not the case. It just isn't. If you go to Westminster, like right across the political divide, there'll be different views on different parts of this particular policy. That's just the way it is. It's the same in the South. It's the same across the world. It is not an issue that is usually whipped on in democratic parties in the modern world. I think that's fair enough. And we also have to be honest that our party was split down the middle on it. That's fair enough. That's not a weakness to have people with different views. Other parties were the same. The Alliance Party have a conscious position on this as well. It's fair enough, and it's a way of managing a political party. It's a way of recognising that not everybody thinks the same, but they can share a broad vision for how society should be ordered. But on this one particular very sensitive and difficult issue, it's normal and to have a conscious position, and I think it's quite liberating, actually.
Okay, well, we'll leave that issue there because we spent probably a good amount of time on it. I want to finish up with a question. How do things currently stand between the SDLP and Fianna Fáil? Is the official partnership still in place?
Well, I suppose when you think about how that came around, there was lots of talk in the media about mergers and pre-mergers and everything else, and that wasn't common for me. What I had said, and what we had said very clearly, is that we were intent on working together on policies to try to change, try to influence the Irish government. The Irish government are now spending I've got now £500 million in a bank account to spend on the shared island unit, which will actually be about really investing in our economy and our society north of the border. I'm pretty sure that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the partnership we have with Fianna Fáil and the influence that I was able to bring to bear on the Taoiseach to bring that about. So that's a very tangible, and for us it was about people, it was about influencing the Irish government, and I think we've done that quite successfully. Is this the precursor to a merger? It isn't. I mean, and the SDLP will always, in my view, exist for as long as people vote for it, and I have defended the right and that position for all throughout those discussions with Fianna Fáil and with anybody else, and that remains the position.
I mean, we got another question on this. SDLP claim to be a left-leaning party, a centre left-leaning party. How can that be the case when they're in a partnership with Fianna Fáil?
Well, we'll just look at how we vote and our manifestos and everything we say. I think we have been to the left of nearly every party, probably bar the People Before Profit in the Assembly. If you look at our voting record, much further to the left than Sinn Féin. We weren't the people who voted to send the Tory party the power to change and cut benefits for our most vulnerable. We've always voted to protect union rights. We're a social democratic party. That's who we are. Our policies have never been changed or altered by anybody. I don't think Fianna Fáil are a right-wing party either, but that's another conversation for another day. But the SDLP stands on its own 2 feet. We're a social democratic and Labour party. Our policies reflect that. Our voting record reflects that. Everything that I do and Claire Hanna does in Westminster pretty clearly reflects that. And I'd love someone to tell me how that has changed. It hasn't one bit. And we're members of the European Socialists as well.
But of course, Claire Hanna resigned the SDLP whip over this issue, said that she would never be associated with a partnership with Fianna Fáil.
And that was fine for Claire, and Claire's back in the fold, and we work very well together. We were meeting this morning about political strategy, and people had different views on that, and that's fine. And we look at it in time, and we can see how it all worked out. But the reality is, the SDLP, and I said this at the time, I say it again, the Social Democratic and Labour Party are here to stay. Those values, those policies are going nowhere. They were never on the line. They were never up for negotiation or up for grabs. And I think we have just used the influence that we have to bring about real change in people's lives. And I think the the Shared Island Fund will bring about a real change in people's lives, particularly in areas that have been left behind. It'll do a whole lot more, frankly, than the Northern Ireland Executive have ever done for certain areas in the north that have been left behind. So I think we use their influence well. But the party is the party. It has never changed its perspective and all that. I know people took a different view. That's fine. I'm very comfortable and broad-shouldered on all of that. And but we work very closely together. And I would challenge anybody to look at our voting record anywhere, whether in Westminster or Stormont or anywhere else, and to tell us how we're not social democrats. And we're very much in that political space and work very closely with our friends in Labour in Westminster as well.
I half lied to you because I do have one other question I want to put to you because it was sent in. And
finally.
I know, and I think I believe you've answered it before, but I'll let you do so again. In reference to plans made to mark Northern Ireland's centenary, which was in the news again today, for which Seamus Heaney was included in the branding, who I believe went to the same secondary school as you, I think. Yes. You tweeted a picture of Heaney with the quote, "Be advised, my passport screen, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen." Within the context of our previous conversation about including unionists in a new Ireland, was that tweet ill-advised?
Yes, it was, and I've said that already. It wasn't very clever, and it was in response, though. You have to remember, it was in response, though, to the NIO, British government, using Seamus Heaney's image without asking his family, and I found that quite difficult. Seamus Heaney wasn't somebody, I don't think he would have allowed himself to be used by anybody for their political purposes, or us either. He wouldn't have allowed anybody to use him in that way, and I just thought it was crass. Did I respond correctly? No, I didn't. And Twitter's not the place for context or nuance. And I think we all learn those lessons over and over again. But that's fine. In terms of centenary, look, I have said very clearly we will involve ourselves in marking the centenary, but in a way that it reflects the fact that a lot of us think Northern Ireland and partition wasn't a very good idea. It was a tragedy for many people, a triumph for others. That's fine, but we would like to have a discussion about how it all has worked out, rather than just. And you have to remember, I met the British government a number of times over last summer and said very clearly we would engage. But don't talk about celebrating. Don't talk about, because that just immediately makes it very difficult for people whose political philosophy is rooted in the fact that we think partition was a bad idea. But they went ahead and sent me a letter, invited me onto the forum, talking about how they're going to celebrate Northern Ireland, and that was just crass. And it's about.
Is there not a distinction, though, Colum, between celebrating partition and celebrating Northern Ireland?
It's very difficult for an Irish nationalist to celebrate partition. We can reflect on it, we can mark it, we can discuss how it went, and do that in a very respectful way. None of us is meant to be disrespectful, but I'm not going to be used by this particular British government and their kind of approach to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland that you're going to see rolling out over the next few months and years. And remember, this is not about us. It's all about everything they're doing here is about Scotland.
But is there nothing to celebrate about Northern Ireland? You can set.
Of course there is.
Okay.
Oh no, I can.
So it's 100 years not a good time to celebrate those things, even if you think that this partition was a bad idea.
Well, I mean, but that's not how this was framed. I'm very happy, and I go to any event that's about that, and we're going to run our own events around this. And I think there's a lot to be celebrated, particularly since the civil rights movement and the changes that were able to be made by, the civil rights movement, then by political parties like the SDLP, around changing how employment law was ordered, bringing around the Good Friday Agreement and offering people who'd been denied a place in society a very important part in society. And a lot of people have done well because of that. We're very happy about how we've achieved those changes. We're only getting started as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot more to do and a lot more to change and a lot more to change to bring about. But I don't think anybody from my perspective is going to celebrate partition, and this was a missed opportunity in my view. And I made it very clear that we would have been prepared to be involved in a much more reflective celebration. And by the way, I totally respect anybody's right to celebrate whatever they want, and that's fair. And this is a place made up of different views, but that's my view, and I think it's frankly fair enough to hold it. But we will engage respectfully and reflect in a reflective kind of way about the 100 years that we've had, and it'll be for us about looking forward to the next 100.
Okay, Colum Eastwood, we're going to leave it there. There were questions we didn't get to, but we will have to have you back sometime next year in person in order to ask them. Thank you so much for giving up your time for us this evening. I'm sure you would have rather have been sitting somewhere with a glass of wine, but instead you're with us, so thank you so much. Thank you to the LitTalk, as always, to Matt and to Ryan in particular, and the entire committee for organising another great event. I think we are back next Friday evening with Naomi Long, so please do join us then. Until then, thank you very much to Colum once again for giving up your time. Thanks to you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.